That day, amidst the dust and roar of engines in the heart of Saigon, there was a young man, his hands holding electrical pliers, his clothes stained with the grime of construction, quietly weaving through narrow alleys to earn a living. His name was Nguyen Van Troi, an ordinary electrician, someone you'd likely overlook at first glance, never suspecting that behind his slender figure burned a heart ablaze with patriotism. He wasn't born to be a hero. He was simply a son of Quang Nam, raised in the midst of war, used to wrapping rice in areca leaves, having once witnessed his father dragged away by soldiers in a crowded market. Yet it was from those harsh days that a dream began to grow in his heart, to do something for his country, even if it meant giving his life. Then the opportunity came. When the nation was drowning in the shadows of bombs and oppression, when the enemy's armored convoy thundered across the Kongli Bridge, he chose not to bow his head. He carried explosives, and with them, the hopes of an entire generation, into the heart of the enemy. Not for glory, not for reward, but for a simple reason. If I don't stand up, who will? That was Nguyen Van Troi, a 24-year-old man who walked to the execution ground with eyes shining like the stars, a man who refused to be blindfolded before the firing squad, and instead raised his head high, shouting the name of his homeland at the edge of life and death. From that moment on, he was no longer just an electrician. He became an immortal symbol of patriotism, of Vietnamese courage, a modern national hero, forever living in the hearts of generations to come. From the Quang homeland, the seed of a flame. In a small village by the Thu Bon River, where the earth cracked under the summer heat and turned to mud during the rains, a shirtless, barefoot boy ran along the village path, his laughter as bright as the call of early season birds. That boy was Nguyen Van Troi, born in 1940 in Thanh Quet Village, Dien Thang Commune, Dien Ban District, Quang Nam Province. His mother carried vegetables to the market. His father was a laborer toiling in Da Nang. The family was poor, living on cassava mixed rice, but the boy's smile never left his lips. Troi's childhood passed in the sound of early rooster crows, in his mother's lullabies beneath a thatched roof, and in the whispers of villagers about military marches, arrests, and those who followed the Viet Minh being tied up in the village hall by the enemy. Stories of the resistance against the French were no strangers to him. They were told at dinner through the smoke of wood stoves burning into his memory like quiet embers. He didn't fully understand politics, but he knew the pain of watching his mother kneel at a military post to beg for his father's release. He knew what hatred was, seeing villagers tied to posts and beaten in public markets. The land of Quang taught Troi to grow up with dignity, with anger, and with a silent belief, one day our people will rise. In 1954, the Geneva Accords split the country in two. He followed his father to Saigon, leaving behind his childhood river and the village bamboo groves. That splendid city greeted his family with nights under bridges and days spent laboring while waiting for charity meals. Life was no easier there. But it was in this urban jungle, under the glow of American lights, that the teenage Nguyen Van Troi quietly matured, in silence but with resolve. While others dreamed of wealth, he quietly wished to do something for his country. That dream made no noise, no decoration. It quietly took root in the heart of a young electrician, like wires hidden inside walls, yet carrying life-giving energy everywhere. And one day, the silent current within Troi would explode, like a lightning bolt across the southern sky. Kongli Bridge, where a flame rose to the sky. In early 1960s Saigon, it seemed the city had fallen completely into enemy hands. American troops landed, armored convoys roared down the streets, puppet soldiers guarded every alley, while loudspeakers ceaselessly preached about peace and freedom. But beneath that flashy surface, in dark alleys and under scorching tin roofs, a generation of youth was silently rising. They had no guns, no armor, only calloused hands, unwavering hearts, and a deep belief. This country must not belong to invaders. At that time, Nguyen Van Troi was just over 20. He worked as an electrician, a trade for the meticulous and cautious. Yet within that quiet man surged a hidden current of fierce fire. While climbing electric poles and fixing wires, Troi carefully observed every corner of the city, memorizing escape routes, spots to hide explosives, and safe hiding places. He was not just a worker. He was a commando, a member of the Special Operations Unit of Interzone 5, secretly operating in the heart of the enemy's territory, where death could strike at any moment. Then, in early May 1964, explosive news broke. U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara would visit Saigon to inspect the southern battlefield. A top symbol of American power, the architect behind bombing campaigns, troop deployments, and bloodshed, would travel over Kong Li Bridge, the vital artery between Tan Son Nhut Airport and the government center. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, but also a mission with no way out. The Saigon commandos crafted an assassination plan, and the volunteer was Nguyen Van Troi. He didn't hesitate. When asked why, he simply said, "If I don't do it, who will?" May 2nd, 1964. Saigon was as hot and noisy as ever, its streets jammed with traffic. But beneath it all, a storm was quietly brewing. Nguyen Van Troi wore a hat, a worker's uniform, and carried a fabric bag containing a homemade mine, carefully prepared explosives. He made his way to Kong Li Bridge, pretending to repair roadside electrical lines. Every step felt like stepping into fate. He knew if he failed, he would die. If he succeeded, he could still die. But more important than anything else was to show the world that Vietnamese people would not bow their heads. No one had the right to casually stroll over the bones and blood of this nation. Yet fate was cruel that day. As he planted the mine under the bridge, secret agents spotted him. A sudden blow, a shout, Troi was caught on the spot. His hands were tied behind his back. He was dragged away and beaten nearly to death. In prison, the torture was relentless. The agents tried to extract names, locations, and secrets. But Nguyen Van Troi, the electrician from Quang Nam, remained silent and smiled. Once, an American officer asked him, "What do you want before you die?" He calmly replied, "I want to see my country independent. I want your soldiers gone from my homeland." Nguyen Van Troi's image spread across the globe like a lightning bolt. A young Vietnamese man, shackled in a Saigon prison, standing tall, staring straight into the international press's cameras. His courage moved millions. In Cuba, the movement Yo Soy Van Troi, I am Troi, gained momentum. Young people took to the streets demanding his release. In Venezuela, students kidnapped a U.S. officer and declared they'd only release him if Saigon spared Nguyen Van Troi. Even American media widely reported it, a failed assassination attempt that shook the empire's propaganda machine. The revolutionary side proposed a prisoner exchange, release Troi in return for a U.S. officer. The Saigon regime initially agreed. Troi was removed from his cell, thinking he'd live. But cruelly, they changed their minds and returned him to prison. His execution was scheduled for October 15, 1964. When the puppet soldiers tried to cover his face, Troi pushed the cloth away. "No, I want to see my country one last time." He walked to the execution ground without a blindfold, head held high, eyes fixed on the enemy's guns. His final words thundered through the sky, "Down with American imperialism, long live Vietnam, long live President Ho." 9 shots rang out. The electrician fell. But the fire in his heart did not die. That flame passed on to the youth of the South. Troi no longer lived in flesh, but he lived in the spirit of every battle, every flame, every flag raised on the front lines. The spiritual legacy, a flame that never dies in the heart of the nation. Nguyen Van Troi fell at the Chi Hoa execution ground that year, but his death was not an end. It was a beginning. The beginning of a legend. The beginning of a generation rising. In a time when bombs tore through the fields, when gunfire drowned out lullabies, the image of a young man daring to sacrifice himself in protest, not for fame, not for gain, but for his homeland, ignited a strange flame in the hearts of the Vietnamese. A belief that this nation is not powerless, not nameless, and will never kneel. There was no grand monument built for Nguyen Van Troi in those years, but he lived in the monument of the people's hearts. In the cities of South Vietnam, students quietly passed around handwritten notes about Nguyen Van Troi, the man who refused the blindfold before the gun. In marketplace corners and working-class neighborhoods, his name was spoken like that of an old friend, a son who had fallen so that the whole family could hold their heads high. His name echoed all the way to Cuba, Venezuela, Argentina. There, he wasn't seen as a terrorist, as the Americans called him, but as a liberation fighter, the Che Guevara of the East. President Fidel Castro himself emotionally called Nguyen Van Troi a comrade in arms, even naming a school in Havana after him. In Vietnam, the name Nguyen Van Troi began appearing everywhere, on streets, schools, factories. The song Nguyen Van Troi Lives On was sung during youth union gatherings, a haunting melody woven with sorrow and pride. You fell, we rise. You were silenced, millions speak. Nguyen Van Troi is not only a symbol of courage, he left behind a timeless message. Young people do not need to live long, only to live meaningfully. In peacetime, today's generation does not walk to execution grounds, does not crawl under bridges with bombs. But when facing the line between right and wrong, truth and lies, justice and corruption, when confronted with laziness, apathy, cowardice, and compromise, Troy's example still shines like a moral compass. He teaches us to dare to speak, dare to act, dare to live with ideals. A modern national hero. Nguyen Van Troi was born after the war against the French, but his spirit carried the unyielding fire of Truong Quoc Tuan, Nguyen Trung Trúc, Phan Dinh Dot. He is not just a figure of wartime valor, but a symbol of the modern Vietnamese. Living in a new era, yet never forgetting they are descendants of those who walked to the firing line without needing a blindfold. Nguyen Van Troi was not physically tall, but he rose like a tower of national faith. He was not a thinker, not a writer, not a government official, but he inspired a generation with his silent, selfless choice to sacrifice, expecting nothing in return. Today, whenever we walk along a street bearing the name Nguyen Van Troi, we should pause for a moment to hear again the final words he left behind, not only for those who fired the bullets, but for all of us. Long live Vietnam. A vow, a testament, a declaration of life itself. The flame of Nguyen Van Troi and its resonance across the 5 continents. When 9 fatal shots rang out at Chi Hoa Execution Ground on October 15, 1964, many believed Nguyen Van Troi had died. But few expected that, from that very moment, a resilient Vietnam would be recognized by the world through his name. No longer merely the internal story of a small, divided nation, Nguyen Van Troi's death shook the conscience of the progressive world. Amid propaganda that framed the Vietnam War as a mission of liberation, the self-sacrificing act of an unknown electrician, his defiant cry before the rifle, shattered the imperialist narrative. An earthquake in Latin America. News of Nguyen Van Troi's execution spread to Cuba like a summer storm. The entire capital of Havana was shaken. President Fidel Castro called him an international fighter, a living testament to anti-American resistance, not just for Vietnam, but for all oppressed nations. In Cuba, schools, streets, and monuments were named after Nguyen Van Troi. His image, bright eyes, a calm face walking to the execution ground, was printed in newspapers, on postcards, and spoken of by schoolchildren as a hero of humanity. In Venezuela, students captured a U.S. officer to pressure the South Vietnamese regime not to execute Nguyen Van Troi. They held up banners reading, "Yo soy Van Troi," I am Troi. None of them had ever met Troi or spoke his language, but they understood the universal language of freedom and justice that he had spoken with his blood. Echoes from Asia to Europe. The Soviet Union, China, North Korea, East Germany, and many socialist nations simultaneously condemned the execution. Solidarity movements with Vietnam suddenly had a new banner, the banner bearing the name of a 24-year-old electrician who dared to die for his country. Global newspapers wrote about Troi with varied tones. Some called him the unyielding death row prisoner, others the man who stared down death, and some simply called him the heart of Saigon. In anti-war protests across Paris, Berlin, Tokyo, and New Delhi, people chanted Nguyen Van Troi as a password of global conscience. A man who had never set foot on those continents, yet lived within them as a living symbol of the yearning to break free from oppression and exploitation. From Saigon's execution ground to the world's classrooms. Nguyen Van Troi's story went beyond politics. It seeped into culture, education, and the arts. Songs, poems, paintings, and short plays were inspired by him. Schools in Cuba, Mexico, and Chile bore his name as a symbol of resistance. International youth organizations marked October 15, the day he was executed, as a memorial day for international fighters who died for justice. In many countries, Nguyen Van Troi's image was included in textbooks as a vivid example of Vietnamese courage and patriotism in the 20th century. Vietnamese people standing tall on the world stage. After Troi's death, Vietnam was no longer a small Southeast Asian country, as Western politicians had often said. the world began to see that this nation had people who knew how to live and dared to die for freedom, and that alone made global powers cautious. Nguyen Van Troi not only elevated the Vietnamese people in the eyes of the international community, but also struck a blow that cracked the false mask of democracy worn by the US and the Saigon regime before the world. A small flame that burns in the heart of humanity. It is often said, a young person who dies may be forgotten. But Nguyen Van Troi is different. He died at age 24, an age when many are still searching for purpose, unsure why they live. But Troi chose to die so others could live with meaning. And that very choice made him immortal, not only in Vietnam, but in the hearts of millions around the globe, those who had never met him, but remember his name whenever the word hero is spoken. Nguyen Van Troi, a modern national hero. Throughout the course of history, Vietnam has never lacked heroes. From legendary figures like Saint Giong, the Trung sisters, to Nguyen Trai, Nguyen Huệ, Nguyen Trung Trúc, and Phan Dinh Dot, each era had someone who rose to become a shield of the nation, a flame of resistance against foreign invaders. But Nguyen Van Troi did not emerge from ancient legends. He didn't wield a spear or ride a horse across the fields. He was the image of the modern young Vietnamese, wearing an electrician's uniform, riding a bicycle to work, living in the heart of a bustling city, yet never abandoning his ideals. That is what made Nguyen Van Troi a symbol of the modern national hero, an ordinary man who dared to do something extraordinary. No armor, no titles, no medals. He turned himself into a moral benchmark for future generations. What made him great was not just the act of planting explosives, but the conscious and resolute choice to sacrifice himself for a cause he believed to be just. In his time, when many young people lived halfway between fear and safety, Nguyen Van Troi chose to step into the most dangerous place. And as death drew near, he burned the brightest. He was not only a man of war, but a man of conscience, even in times of peace. When the country achieved independence, many questioned, was it worth it for Nguyen Van Troi to die? A bright young man with a promising future. Why choose to end his life so early? But without people like Troi, history might have turned out differently. History is not written by those who live long, but by those who live deeply and rightly. Nguyen Van Troi lived only 24 years, but his impact has echoed for more than 6 decades, and perhaps forever. A mirror for the modern age. In today's world, filled with the noise of social media, where ideals are easily replaced by instant fame, Nguyen Van Troi's image walking to the execution ground without a blindfold still hits like a slap to the face of weakness, compromise, and moral decline. He dared to stare into the barrel of a gun, while many today do not even dare to look into their own conscience. Young people today don't need to enter the jungle, dive into rivers, or plant bombs like Troi. But his spirit remains deeply relevant. Dare to live with integrity amidst a crowd of fake noise. Dare to stand with the truth when everyone else chooses silence. Dare to act for the community instead of retreating into selfishness. Dare to dream big for the nation and for humanity. An undying Troi, who lived like a flame and died like an oath etched into the hearts of generations, is not just the past. He is the embodiment of the belief that in every era there must be those who refuse to submit, who do not choose comfort over justice. He is the bridge between the heroic traditions of our ancestors and the meaningful responsibility of today's youth. An ordinary young man entered history, not because he had supernatural power, but because he dared to live faithfully to what he believed until his final breath. And for that, Nguyen Van Troi did not die. He still lives, on every street bearing his name, in every classroom, every lesson, and in the hearts of those who still love this land, living forever in a name. History may fade with the passing years, but there are people, once they enter its pages, who never leave the heart of a nation. Nguyen Van Troi is one of those people. He was not born into a prestigious family, held no high academic degrees, nor did he fight on the battlefield with a weapon in hand. Yet it was his conscious and idealistic choice to live and die that made the world stop and listen to Vietnam and recognize a small nation's unbreakable spirit. He embodied a simple yet profound truth. You don't need to live long. Just live right. In an age where patriotism can be blurred by individualism, consumerism, and compromise, the light from Nguyen Van Troi's example remains a guiding milestone for every Vietnamese to reflect upon. Reflect to ask if we are living deeply enough. Reflect to see if we dare to stand for what is right. Reflect to understand, without living for ideals, we may be swept away by the trivial. Troy's act was not merely a cry of protest, but a wake-up call, a reminder that every generation, in war or peace, must live with purpose and carry a flame to guide the way. From that execution ground in Chi Hoa, Nguyen Van Troi's cry, "Long live Vietnam," did not fade. It still echoes in classrooms, in the rhythm of youth movements, in every step taken by young people seeking meaning for their lives and their nation. Nguyen Van Troi left this world at the age of 24, but he lived a complete life. And like an underground river, cool, silent, but enduring, he continues to flow in the veins of the nation, like a modern legend, like a flame that never goes out. You are no longer here, but your name remains rising in our hearts with every step we take.